Have you ever studied really hard for a test, only to find that while you're in the midst of taking that test, you suddenly can't think of information that you know you studied? We've all been there. This is a really frustrating experience. But did you know that when you experience an episode of forgetting like this, it's usually not the case that the information disappeared from your memory. Usually, the information is still in there somewhere, and the problem is you're simply failing to access that information. So you might be wondering, are there things that you can do to get yourself out of this type of situation of forgetting when you find yourself in it? And it turns out that there are. Usually what you need is a really good cue to jog your memory. Some cues are better than others, or there's some characteristics that can make a cue more effective. One characteristic that can make a cue particularly effective is its uniqueness. That is, how uniquely the cue ties to the particular memory or set of memories that you're trying to retrieve at that moment. You may have experienced this in real life, in fact. Have you ever noticed how a certain cue in your environment, like a particular smell, for example, can suddenly seem to take you right back to a moment in your childhood or at some point earlier in your life? Maybe you're walking through an antique store and you pick up an old perfume bottle, and upon sniffing it, you're suddenly taken back to childhood memories of your grandmother. Maybe it's that your grandmother wore this very unique type of perfume from back in that time period, and you've not really had an opportunity to smell that type of perfume at any other point in your life up until now in this antique store. Well, the uniqueness of that cue, or the unique way in which that particular smell ties to these particular earlier childhood memories, make it a very effective cue for jogging your memories for these particular events. This same type of experience wouldn't happen for a more common smell that isn't unique. So for example, if you had smelled peppermint instead of that unique type of perfume, it probably wouldn't trigger any particular memory because there are so many possible memories that that cue ties to. So a really effective cue is unique in nature. You might be wondering, how can you capitalize on this principle of unique cues for when you're taking a test and experiencing potential forgetting? Obviously, you can't bring external cues with you to a test, and smell probably isn't going to be very useful in that context. But realize that anything that you bring in your own mind to the test is fair game. And so the key is to generate mental cues for yourself. Things that you're likely to think of for yourself while you're in the midst of taking the test that will help to uniquely tie to that memory that you're trying to retrieve at that moment. There are really two key features of a mental cue for yourself that will make it effective. One is that the cue should uniquely specify the memory that you're trying to retrieve. It needs to be unique. But the second is that the cue itself needs to be something that you'll be able to think of in the context of the test-taking situation. So it has to be mental, so it needs to be something that you'll be likely to think of on your own, but that will also uniquely tie to the memory that you're trying to access. So how do you generate a mental cue that you'll be likely to think of later on? Let's go over an example that maybe wouldn't work so well. That might be a cue that you generate at the time that you're studying, but then might not be able to regenerate upon taking the test. Let's say you're trying to learn what an operculum does and what an operculum is for your biology test. If you're not familiar with this term, an operculum is basically a flap-like structure that covers the gill of a fish and can open and close. So let's say that while you're in the process of studying operculum for your test, you notice that you're a little bit hungry and you realize that your mother had just recently texted you this great recipe at epicurious.com. And you notice, well, the word operculum sort of reminds me of Epicurious because I'm hungry right now and I'm thinking of this. So I'm going to use Epicurious as my cue for thinking of operculum. Well, here's the problem. When you're later on in the test-taking situation, it's going to be a completely different context than the one that you're in at that moment that you thought of Epicurious. First of all, you might not be hungry during the testing situation, and second of all, you won't have recently looked at a text from your mother that says Epicurious. And so what you might find is that you're unable to generate what your mental cue was at the time that you're sitting at the test. You might be sitting there thinking, now what was that cue again that I was going to use to try to think of this word? Also, the word Epicurious might not obviously tie to the word operculum, even if you do think of it. So let's say you think of Epicurious and then you think, oh gosh, what was that word that was supposed to make me think of? So now let's talk about a better method. You want to try to generate a cue while you're studying that you'll be likely to think of again when you're in a completely different context, the context being your test-taking situation. Well, you need something you'll easily be able to think of. And so what you might consider is when you look at the word operculum, can you tie it to the actual function of that word? An operculum, again, is sort of a flap that opens and closes. And so maybe one way to generate a cue is to think to yourself, well, oper, that beginning part of operculum, sort of looks and sounds like open, which is part of its function. So you might think operculum, open. I want to think of open for opens and closes as my cue to get to operculum. So if you're asked on the test to think of the word that describes this particular organ or this particular function, you might think, oh, well, open. This question is asking about that cover that opens and closes. Open. I remember now, operculum. And vice versa. If you see the word operculum on the test and are asked to describe it, well, now you can look at that word and think, oh, oper, I remember open. And that might help to lead you to the set of memories that you need to retrieve at that moment. You could even take your cue generation a step further in that situation. You might come up with something like, open is my cue for if forgetting looms. Oper, cue, loom. Open is my cue for if forgetting looms, L-U-M, loom, to help get you to the full word operculum. So remember, a cue can help lead you to a memory that you're having trouble accessing. Anything you bring in your own head to an exam is fair game. So you can mentally generate cues for yourself to use later on for when you're in the exam. The best cues are ones that are unique, but that will also be easy for you to conjure up in your own mind during the test.